The United States of America, the world's biggest hypocrites on democracy. David Roots TV. Greetings to the family. Greetings to anyone who's able to tune in and listen to this presentation and this reasoning on what right now is current events. It's currently at the recording of this video, January the 13th, 2021. And this is a very timely topic. It's actually linked to a topic I wanted to do for a while, but the goings on of recent events in the world, in particular in the United States, led me to jump on it and actually get this video presentation done. And you can see that the title, main title, is the USA, the world's biggest hypocrites on democracy. But the subtitle gives more information, aka Gunboat Democracy and Democracy Favoritism. And that's what this video is all about. So when it comes to the current events that we are talking about, that I'm talking about, I'm specifically speaking to the recent, what would they say, protest that took place on Capitol Hill in the United States of America. Capitol Hill being the main epicenter of government for federal government in the United States, in Washington, D.C. So you have the White House, which is in Washington, D.C., but you also have Capitol Hill, which is where the members of Congress will meet, okay? And recently, a group of so-called Trump supporters, pro-Trump supporters, were accused of storming the Capitol building during the convening of a session, congressional session. You can go and look it up. This is a past event, so you can go and look up all of the news. I just took a little snapshot from the BBC of some of the titles from the news reports as they were reporting. You can see it says, House debates immediate removal of Trump, pressures on the US Vice President Mike Pence to act to remove President following the Capitol riots. And then on the bottom, excuse me, it says US Capitol attack. And you can see the language that they're talking about. There's an attack, they're saying, on the Capitol, where the protesters have said that they were rioting. Some people were killed. I think it was about 5 people that were killed as a result, some directly and some indirectly. As you can see in the news, it says FBI to probe officer's death during pro-Trump riot. And of course, the media always needs a poster child, a scapegoat, and in this case, literally a goat. You can see this QAnon shaman, which is the gentleman with the horns and the fur cap, who is charged, one of the people who's going to be charged over the pro-Trump riots. He is known as a QAnon supporter, which I'm not going to go into, at least not in depth here. QAnon is supposed to be a group of people who question the validity of the recent elections, presidential elections, as well as believe that there is a conspiracy, counter movement at the highest levels amongst the elite to remove Trump and to discredit him. And so some of the supporters, they say, of these protests and participants in the riots were people that were involved in this movement. And there's been a huge outcry in America, as well as not so much around the world, but particularly in America, saying how these people that have stormed the the capital are anti-democratic, and that they are, violent and at least militant in a sense. And it led me to really pull together what I wanted to say previously, that the United States of America, and we're not talking about individuals, we're talking about as a political bloc, a geopolitical entity, always promotes democracy, or promotes themselves as a model of democracy, when realistically, we all know that they are the biggest hypocrites on democracy worldwide. They are a government and a geopolitical entity that uses democracy when they see fit, or proposes and promotes the idea of democracy when they see fit. But when it's not in their best interest, they are the quickest to use military and espionage means in order to pervert the democracy of other peoples around the world. And this is not a modern phenomenon only. Okay, so right now it's 2021. This isn't something just in the last 10 years, with the Middle East and parts of the world that have had to fall foul to so-called American democracy or American-supported democracy movements. This is extended long before that. Hence the title says, AKA Gunboat Democracy. So in other words, gunboat democracy is, we're going to create a democratic, or a image of a democratic society, but we're going to do it by force, by military force. So it's really not democratic, the process that we've put in place somewhere. We've forced it on the people that are there because it suits our best interests. And democracy favoritism. In other words, the United States are known supporters of political entities that will promote their best interests. And so when there are human rights abuses by those same entities, the United States will say, no, they have a democratic process in place. But as soon as it doesn't support their best interest, the United States will withdraw their support and their claim that those places are democratic. That's what you call democracy favoritism. So we're going to look at some examples so that people are very clear as to the real history of the United States, and not to be fooled by the mainstream media and other political pundits and commentators who may seem to pit one side against the other. Okay? In this shadowy world, in this, down the rabbit hole, which is sort of a moniker that the so-called QAnon use, down this rabbit hole, there are lots of twists and turns, and things are not always what they seem. So let's look back at how the USA are some of the world's, along with the British, it's not just the USA, some of the world's biggest hypocrites when it comes to the promotion and idealism of democracy. So let's start with the most obvious. And I've tried to include references where needed. I will tell you straight up, for this presentation, I've used a lot of stuff from Wikipedia. It's a decent enough source to use to make my point. It has references within it. This is not meant to be an historical forensic examination. It's meant to give an overview of where the United States has acted in an undemocratic manner, but still champion themselves as some sort of democratic idea and hero around the world. And so the most obvious place to start is in the United States itself. In particular, their aggression and outright exploitation, and in some cases could be said genocide, of the Native American, quote unquote, Native American First Nation peoples. So if you look on this, right on this GIF that came from www.vox.com, you can see that it's a time-lapse model of how Native American lands dwindled from the time of the earliest entry of the Europeans, in particular Americans, when it became America. So we would have been talking about the War of Independence to present day. And immediately it will strike you how at one point, obviously, all of the American land, there's the land in North America, in some way belonged or was claimed by, not necessarily politically, but people lived on there, Native American First Nation people. And over time, that land was removed from their possession by various different means. Okay, and we're going to examine that very quickly. But it's quite dramatic and quite stark. And anyone visiting the United States now will see that there's hardly any resemblance of any native people in that country. Obviously, there are so-called reservations, but even they are a far cry from what space and land the Native American people had access to previously. So, when did this start? We can look at the 1795 Treaty of San Lorenzo. And I've highlighted and read some of the key points because we don't want the video to be too long. So this Treaty of San Lorenzo defined the border between the United States and Spanish Florida, because remember, the original colonizers of America would have been the Spanish, followed by the French, okay, as well as the British. So the Spanish had the southern part all the way over to what we would call New Mexico and Mexico, aka New Spain. France would come in and get Louisiana, going all the way up to Canada, and the British would land on the and claim to the eastern seaboard, okay, Virginia and Jamestown and all of that. And so in 1795, a treaty was signed between the United States, the newly formed United States, and Spanish Florida, guaranteeing the United States navigation rights on the Mississippi River. So basically guaranteeing that one part is the United States and the other part is Spain, because it was a big dispute. It wasn't theirs to guarantee because it was native people's lands. So that was the first act of stealing. And then in 1830, by 1830, you have what's called the Trail of Tears, part of a series of forced relocations of approximately 100,000 Native Americans between 1830 and 1850. Okay? Or in other words, known as the Indian removal. They tried to make it sound nice. 100,000. And what does it show? It shows that many of these nations, First Nation peoples, were forcibly removed from their ancestral homelands in the southeastern United States to areas to the west of the Mississippi. And you can see that on the GIF, on the map. They start pushing them all the way west, just pushing them west, west, and west. And then finally, in the 1887 Dawes Act, it authorized the President of the United States to subdivide Native American tribal communal landholdings. No right, the United States had no right to subdivide landholdings that belonged to native people. But they put in place these political legislative acts amongst their governments, and by force moved these people and eventually caused their decimation. And this is democracy, favoritism mixed with gunboat democracy. The United States has no reason to put themselves as any sort of model for democracy based off of their earliest history. So that was the initial aspect of the United States, but it doesn't stop there. So when we look at current United States colonies or holdings, as well as historical holdings, because some of these have now gained independence, in particular Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam. The reason why I have all three is that you have to talk about them all together. So originally, a lot of this revolved around, obviously, the slave trade and money. And that money, that economy, that commerce was based around plantation economies, in particular sugar. And the Caribbean was a big part of this, okay, a huge part of this, which then also moved to other parts of the world. So most of the Caribbean parts, not most, parts of the Caribbean were held by the Spanish, especially places like Cuba, Hispaniola, places like that, okay, because obviously they were in that southern Northern American area. So we're talking about the Gulf of Mexico. And this also included Puerto Rico, hence why they still speak Spanish to this day. So as time went on, the United States wanted to, one, protect their interest in that region, because Puerto Rico and Cuba are very close to the United States, okay? And so once they had made that agreement to have Florida become part of the United States, having Puerto Rico, Cuba, as well, being held under Spanish occupation would be a national security problem. And so it says the Spanish-American War was an armed conflict between Spain and the United States in 1898. Okay, 1898. So the reason why is that there was an explosion in Cuba on a US warship, and Spain was thought to be involved in this. And so out of this Spanish-American War, it would lead to places like Puerto Rico being invaded. So you can see it says this led to the US involvement in the Philippine Revolution and ultimately to the Philippine-American War. And on July 25, 1898, during the Spanish-American War, the US invaded Puerto Rico with a landing at Guanica. Okay? So because the Spanish and America were fighting, Puerto Rico was invaded by the Americans. Okay? We'll talk about Philippines in a minute. This was all part of a larger sortie between Spain and America around the world. And so this would lead to Puerto Rico being invaded, who were originally occupied by the Spanish, okay, and America would come in and invade them. Now, at the same time, the Americans had interest in other parts, and I put on the map some of the stars. So you can see Spain, America is where the United States is, and you can see 2 stars for Cuba and Puerto Rico. But you can see the influence of America and Spain, of course, was international. All the way on the other side of the world, you'll see a star for the Philippines and a star for Guam. So America was involved in the Spanish-American War, and so they also decided to invade the Philippines, which was part of a Spanish-occupied territory at that time as well. So it says on August 13th, with American commanders unaware that a peace protocol had been signed between Spain and the US, on the previous day in Washington, D.C., American forces captured the city of Manila, which is in the Philippines. Now, the Filipinos thought the Americans, just like, the Puerto Ricans did, thought the Americans were coming to free them from the oppression and the occupation, illegal occupation of Spain. But what did America do? You can see where I have it underlined in red. that it says this battle, the Battle of Manila, marked the end of Filipino-American collaboration, as the American action of preventing Filipino forces from entering the captured city of Manila was deeply resented by the Filipinos. In other words, once America had invaded the Philippines with the help of the Filipinos, the guerrilla warriors, they thought they were coming to free the Filipinos and allow them to establish their own independent state. But the Americans said, no, you're not coming in also from the captured city of Manila, which would then lead to another Philippine-American war. Sorry, another war, the Philippine-American War, which would prove to be more deadly and costly than the Spanish-American War. So the war that they were actually trying to stop, the Spanish-American War for the Filipinos, they ended up being in another war with the Americans, the new occupiers, the new invaders, and losing even more of their people, native people. This is what we call gunboat democracy. And to this day, obviously, Puerto Rico is still an American vassal. Philippines have been given independence, but it would lead to lasting changes for both of those places. And this is what we talk about here. What was the cost of those changes? Underlined in red, it says, while Filipino nationalists viewed the conflict as a continuation of the struggle for independence that began in 1896 with the Philippine Revolution, the US government regarded it as an insurrection. And so what resulted? The war resulted in at least 200,000 Filipino civilian deaths, not military deaths, civilian deaths, mostly due to famine and diseases. And some estimate that this total civilian death may reach up to 1 million. This is the gunboat democracy and the cost that people worldwide have had to deal with from the so-called democratic actions of the United States. How could the US government regard the own people of the Philippines fighting to get their own land back as an insurrection? It's sickening to think about. And as we said, this would extend only 100 years ago. Okay? 100 years ago. So, when we look, eventually, the United States granted independence in 1946 following World War II and the Japanese occupation of the Philippines through the Treaty of Manila. So in other words, it took World War II and the horrendous activities that the Americans participated in with the bombing of Hiroshima, and I'm sure many Philippines would have fought on the side of Americans for them to say, you know what, you've earned your independence, we'll allow you to be independent. Absolutely sickening. And Puerto Rico was not so lucky, because they still are part of America. And I think I have a slide on that. I'm not sure. Let me check. No, I don't. I don't have the slide on Puerto Rico. But just to comment on Puerto Rico, even to this day, in the history of Puerto Rico, there are still people who are fighting for independence from America. And they're being called as terrorist groups. So-called terrorist groups. When they're not terrorist groups, they're simply native people. Or in this case, probably they are the ancestors of the original Spanish invasions, which led to obviously intermixing with the native people, many who were murdered by the Spanish, or at least became sick and ill due to the plantation economy and spreading of disease. But they are, Puerto Ricans. And to this day, people are still fighting for independence from the Americas. Puerto Rico, Philippines. The United States has no claim to being any in any shape or form. Forget what they've done in the 21st century. Okay, the amount of bombings done under Obama and Bush and so on. They have no right to speak to anyone and lecture anyone on democracy. We can even look at Hawaii, another United States territory. Okay, Hawaii. Hawaii is not a country politically. Why? Because it's part of the United States. When it's a nation unto itself. In red, you see I have it highlighted. It says, first settlers to claim Hawaii were sometime between 124 and 1120 AD. Okay, when the islands were first settled by Polynesians. In other words, this is an ancient place with an ancient set of people. Yes, they would have had the wars amongst themselves and conflicts, but they were self-governing. They had their own nation, their own customs. Okay? For those of you that don't know the history of Hawaii and its location, I put on the map. It's located in the Pacific Ocean. It's a very isolated place. Okay? Very extremely beautiful place. But it was first the British explorer that was one of the first imperialistic groups to arrive in Hawaii, and they say maybe the Spanish would have come there previously as well. Okay, but as you can see in red in the third paragraph, it says after Cook's arrival, James Cook, the British explorer, so that would have been 1778. American immigration began soon after. Why? While Protestant missionaries were arriving. Okay? As well as, again, we're looking at money, because all of this revolves around money. It all revolves around the rich getting richer and taking as much from the poor and those disenfranchised as possible, by both political and military means. And so it says, Americans set up plantations to grow sugar. So we're talking about in the 1800s. Slavery is still going on around the world. It would be the Emancipation Proclamation by the UK would be in 1834. But for the United States, it will come later. So the plantation idea, and people were making lots of money off of plantations. They needed labor and they needed places to grow. And so Hawaii, with its climate, was seen as a key place that could lead to the production of sugar and the import of sugar to its Pacific interest. And it says their methods of plantation farming require substantial labor. Okay, so this is when the American people first came in. And what would happen? Well, the Americans started to obviously mix with the native population. The native population had already declined so much due to disease brought in by the Europeans. Okay, and eventually they would erode the native indigenous peoples' influence in their own government. In red, in the fourth paragraph, Americans within the kingdom government. So that's the kingdom of Hawaii, because you would have had a king who tried to bring Hawaii together. It's not that he was doing it for any altruistic ideas. He was seeking his own power, but he was still a native. Okay, so Americans within the kingdom government rewrote the Constitution, severely curtailing the power of the current king, King Kalukua, and disenfranchising the rights of most native Hawaiians and Asian citizens to vote through excessively high property and income requirements. Now, I'm very familiar with that because the island where I was born, before the voting reform that took place in, I don't want to quote the wrong date, But one of the requirements to vote in the 1900s was that you had to hold a certain amount of property. And of course, that meant only certain people in the island where I was born, Bermuda, it would mean the white British colonial powers would only have the right to vote, and thereby keeping the laws and legislation in a biased way towards their influence and towards their things that they would like to achieve. The same thing was going on in Hawaii. And it says this gave a sizable advantage to plantation owners. Okay? So you had this queen who came along who tried to restore the native Hawaiian pride, to restore the royal powers, it says, in 1893. But she was placed under house arrest by the businessmen. Okay, foreign businessmen with help, who from? The US military. So they are thousands and thousands and thousands of miles away from their own country. And they're interceding in native affairs politically, putting people under house arrest. Why? Because it suits them and their economic interests. And it says, against the Queen's wishes, the Republic of Hawaii was formed for a short time. And then this government agreed on behalf of Hawaii to join the US in 1898 as the territory of Hawaii. And in 1959, the islands became a state of Hawaii of the United States. Again, how sickening is that? We've had the example of how the United States, as a geopolitical bloc for economic reasons, took away the land of the Native American people from their own region, geographical region. The same thing was repeated in Puerto Rico and in the Philippines under the guise of welcoming as liberators. And now we see the same pattern occurring in Hawaii with the US military, a story that we've heard many times before in the 21st century. This is why people like North Korea hold the stance that they hold against the United States, because they've looked at the history of this nation and its political entities and what they do with their gunboat democracy and democracy favoritism. My final example, and I could have given more, but my final example is one that when I read about, and I've done my own research, and you read the stories and you hear the testimonies of the people, will bring tears to your eyes. Because you can imagine, just like the Hawaiians, just like the Native Americans, just like the people in the Philippines, these people, indigenous people, are living in the most beautiful, serene places, surrounded by tropical beauty and resources. And it's the Americans who would come and destroy not only the right to be there, but the very environment itself. So in this case, we're talking about Bikini Island. So the Bikini Islands are located, what they call Bikini, which in the traditional language, probably as it says, Bikini, and it's been mutilated verbally to Bikini. Okay. The very name means coconut place. So you can imagine how beautiful it was. Okay. Another place in the Pacific. And it says, after the Second World War, the Bikini Island inhabitants were removed from their ancestral lands in 1946. So we already started right at the beginning of the United States' occupation or formation with the Native American people. And now we're going all the way up to the 20th century in 1946, where they removed people, inhabitants, from their ancestral lands. Now, in Hawaii's case, it would have been the plantation economy. In the Native Americans' case, it would have been the access to valuable land resources, particularly for mining and farming and so on and so on. Okay? In Puerto Rico and in the Philippines case, it would have been strategic interest. In Bikini Island, in this case, why? Why did they remove these people from their ancestral lands? For nuclear testing. Nuclear testing. They had already dropped the atom bomb in the Second World War, and they wanted to see if they could further develop this technology. And so what? They needed a place to test it. And what better place did they think? Oh, let's go to someone else's home and remove them and test it on their beautiful lands. They carried out 23 nuclear tests between 1946 and 1958. It's sickening. 3 families were resettled. So after that, 3 families were resettled on Bikini Island in 1970, totaling about 100 residents. Okay, so they tried to put them back. But scientists found that it was dangerously high levels of strontium-90, which is a radioactive element, in the well water, and the residents were carrying abnormally high concentrations of cesium-137 in their body. And so they had to be re-evacuated. Absolutely sickening. They destroyed the environment and the natural living habitat and the very health of the indigenous people that were there. The weapons, they say, underlying in red, second paragraph, were detonated on the reef itself, on the sea, in the air, and underwater. So the Americans tested it everywhere. The reef, the sea, the air, underwater, with a combined fission yield of 40.2 megatons. Absolutely sickening. There were 167 Micronesian inhabitants, and they were asked to voluntarily and temporarily relocate. Oh, temporarily relocate for the good of mankind and to end all world wars. And it says, after confused and sorrowful deliberation among the Bikinians, the leader, King Judah, agreed to the US relocation request. Well, that's the problem. Look what he says. We will go believing that everything is in the hands of God. That's where he went wrong. He had lost his native religion and native spirituality, which connected him to the land, and had taken on the spirituality of the original colonizers of those places, the Protestant missionaries that were going all over the Pacific, and then put his trust as a Manchurian candidate into his own oppressor. Okay? There's a word for that when you start loving the person who's holding you hostage. It slipped my mind now. Okay? That's what happened. And so it says the Navy helped them to disassemble what? Their church and community house, and prepared to relocate them. And where did they take them? Not to some other beautiful island, but to an uninhabited Rongerik atoll, which was 1/6 the size of their normal place, their normal home. No one had ever lived there because it had inadequate food and water, as well as due to the deep-rooted traditional beliefs that it was haunted, but they forgot about their traditional beliefs. The United States convinced them, and what? Dropped them off and left them with a few weeks of food and water. How sickening is that? Now, if you look at the Bikini Islands, the modern pictures, the pictures from when they were relocated are mostly in black and white. So these are just some pictures that I included from the internet, from this Guardian article. And you can see how absolutely beautiful it is. Luckily, some of the flora and fauna have recovered. Okay, the coral reefs, could you imagine when the Bikini Islanders who have been living there for centuries, how beautiful they were, how abundant with fish and coconuts the island would have been. But even though some of the land has recovered and the flora and fauna, it says, as you can see in the first paragraph of this article, that in a special report in 2012 to the United Nations Human Rights Council, that this place suffered near irreversible environmental contamination, which has led to the loss of livelihoods, and many people continue to experience indefinite displacement. Indefinite displacement. The water cannot be drunk because of continued contamination. The seafood cannot be eaten, and the plants cannot be farmed, because of contaminated soil. It's all too radioactive still. And more than half of the 167 original inhabitants have died, many going to their graves still longing to return to their homelands. And those on the islands, it says in the last paragraph, further afield, show elevated risk for cancer. So even those people who have moved away still show elevated risk for cancer, particularly those ones that come from radioactivity like thyroid and leukemia. The United States has no right to talk to anyone, whether it's protesters who they're claiming that, oh, this is a mark against, our democracy, that our government and our country doesn't do things politically this way, referring to the events of January 2021. It's all lies and it's all untrue, mist and fog. The United States are the model examples of gunboat democracy. What those protesters did is what their nation is built on. And other people around the world are suffering and will continue to suffer due to the gunboat democracy and democratic favoritism of the United States government as a whole, and by proxy, the United States people, who will endorse the actions of their government, while at the same time claiming and feeling and accepting that they are somehow models of the free world. Let us be clear, the historical record tells us otherwise. This is Dr. David Roots. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Please go and do your own research on the topics that I have talked about. Please also share this video, comment if you wish, and subscribe. Thank you.